What is up, my peepholes? This is your guy, Cly, and it's time for a little DIY. And today's dice set is one that I've been planning ever since I picked up dice making as a hobby. And the inspiration is a little nostalgic for me. Specifically, it was inspired by this. This is the Nickelodeon Time Blaster alarm clock, and I actually had one of these as a kid. Not this exact clock, mind you, because I have absolutely no idea where that one went. I don't know if it got worn out and thrown out, donated to a thrift store, or if it's still sitting in my parents' attic. All that matters is I have this one now, and I actually happened to pick it up at a thrift store for a whopping $3. Which, for those of you who know a thing or two about this line of merchandise, you know that one of these, even without the box in this condition, goes for a whole heck of a lot more. And I completely understand why. Myself and many other people have been in love with this product line's aesthetic ever since it first came out. Though I think I'm going to keep my collection at just this one piece, mainly due to the fact that things like the Talk Blaster telephone are kind of outmoded. In fact, I don't even have a landline here. And the two different styles of Blast Box boomboxes are kinda chonky. However, I may change my tune if I ever happen to get my hands on one of the Blast Pack cassette players, mainly due to the fact that I can play MP3s on that without having to take it apart. But before I digress any further, let's jump into this project, shall we? For this project, I'm going to be using Alumilite Amazing Clearcast casting resin, not a sponsor, a mixing cup, 2 stir sticks, one for mixing my resin and one for dosing out my pigment. And speaking of pigment, I'm going to be using purple mica powder for this one. For the style of dice I've designed for this project, I'm going to need 2 different colors of acrylic paint, and of course, a set of dice molds. Once again, I'm using my custom designed cap molds, and for those of you wondering when the heck the video about these cap molds is coming out, don't worry. As far as I can tell, I only need to test one more thing before I can finally get around to editing that video. I haven't really been doing much 3D printing to test these designs every time I change something, mainly due to the fact that it's been pretty difficult to get my hands on isopropyl alcohol to wash my prints, but as of last week, I found a very nice, easy to get, and lower cost alternative for washing my prints that I may talk about in a future video. I don't know if it'll be a standalone yet though. Now, because of the pigment I'm using in these dice, I find that dye lot is important, so I need to make the entire set at once. And to do that, I first need to mix up 40 milliliters of resin. And because I doubt many of you want to see me mixing resin for 2 minutes, I'll be right back. Next, I need to mix in my mica powder. And because I want the final dice to have a little bit of a swirl pattern to them, I need to add just a little bit of mica powder at a time. This is also why only one of the stir sticks that I'm using in this project is actually going to be doing the stirring. I'd rather not get resin in my pigment powder. Now that I've got my resin to the point where it's just barely opaque when I pull the stir stick out, it's time to let the resin sit for a bit before I start putting it into the molds. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Now, to get my resin into the mold, I'm going to be using both a pipette and a syringe. And just like last time, I'm going to be making a bit of a hybrid of the two, mainly due to the fact that the syringe doesn't reach deep enough into my molds, and the pipettes don't have enough suction to pull up the amazing Clearcast. Once I have the syringe filled with resin, I jab my makeshift needle into the fill hole of the mold and start injecting, making sure to pull out the needle every so often so that trapped gases can escape. Once resin starts backing up into the reservoir when I pull out my needle, I know the mold is full. And then it's time to move on to the next mold. As per usual, when I have all 7 dice molds filled, I put my excess resin into a meeple mold and then pop all of these into my pressure pot for the next 24 hours. And there you go. And I've gotta say, I absolutely love how these turned out. It was definitely worth all of the hassle I had to go through to get from concept to final product. And it's even more hassle than a lot of you probably think. I know some people have been following the progress of this project on the community tab on this channel as well as on my Discord server, and those people know that this project seems to have been cursed from the very start. The first issue came in the form of figuring out what paints I wanted to use. And while I'm absolutely in love with these satin finish paints that I ended up going with, for the curious, they're Michael's store brand paints. Originally, I wanted to go with metallic paints for the numbers and the slime splats. However, finding metallic orange and metallic lime green that both look good and don't cost $12 per 2-ounce bottle is insanely difficult. It got to the point where I was actually making my own paints out of mica powder and varnish, and while they look okay, they don't look this good. Also, the varnish is so much harder to clean off of my dice than any other style of paint that I've used. The next issue came during the making of the dice themselves, because I'm gonna be honest with you, this D4 and this D12 are not the ones that I made using the first batch of resin that I mixed up earlier in this video. And this issue is actually one that pushed this video back 2 weeks from when I originally planned to release it. When I went to sand the D4, I learned that it was impossible to sand the dang thing flat. And if I did end up sanding a side flat, I'd lose a lot of definition like I did with that number 2. So I thought, maybe I warped my mold. Well, that wasn't the case, because after I made a second mold and poured a second dye, it happened again. And it turns out, my dye master was actually warped, in such a way that you can't really tell with the naked eye, and as far as I can see in my viewfinder, I still can't tell just looking at it on camera. But the fact of the matter remained that the dye master is warped, and so, yeah, bad things were happening. But it gets better, because while my mold wasn't warped for my D12, it turns out during the design stage for these dice, I actually laid it out incorrectly. Now, it's not super obvious just looking at the master, but as you can see, I have the 6 here and the 8 here, whereas across from the 6, I have the 5, and across from the 8, I have a 7. That's what's on the cap. And those of you who have seen my video about designing your own dice masters know that I'm a little bit particular about the layout of my numbers. I'm one of those people that puts emphasis on having the visible number and the number on the bottom of the die add up to 1 greater than the number of sides on the dice. So in the case of my D12, where I have an 8 and a 7 as well as a 6 and a 5, that just doesn't fly. Now, I could have just polished up the die, painted it, and gone forward with the video without anyone being the wiser, but I would know. And because I made such a big deal about it in my dice designing video, I didn't want to be a hypocrite even if nobody knew. And if you want to know what triggered the rant in that video, it's D10s. Because the standard retail D10 is laid out in such a way where the opposing faces add up to 9, unless you're talking about the 0 or 10 and a 9, in which case, if you're reading the die correctly, it's 19. There, I've passed on the curse of knowledge to you. All of that ranting out of the way, let's talk more about the dice themselves, because, like I said, I absolutely love how these turned out. The purple is nice and rich, and by letting it sit before I poured it into the molds, I ensured I wouldn't have a ton of it sink to the bottom, or, like with some of the meeples I've made in the past, it all just becomes a uniform color, and that kind of ruins the effect. Oh, and some of you are probably wondering why I put the slime splat on the 1s for these dice. And the simple fact of the matter is, if you watch a lot of the older Nickelodeon game shows, or heck, the old skit comedy show You Can't Do That on Television, you know that if something goes wrong on one of those shows, somebody gets slimed. Hence, the 1 is the slime. Though, of course, I am actually going to be making a version of the D6 where the slime is on the 6, which would make it perfect for the Ghostbusters RPG. Though more about that game in a future video, maybe around the time the next movie comes out, or maybe around Halloween. I don't quite know yet. Also, if you're curious about whether or not I could get away with selling these dice while using the Nickelodeon font, the answer is yes. The most important thing to know about this font is that it is based on a typeface called Balloon from 1939, and while it is most well known for being used in the Nickelodeon logo from 1984 all the way to 2009, as well as being used on the Nick box to this day, it's been used in all kinds of other places. And as such, getting a commercial use license for this font is kinda easy. And that pretty much covers it. All I need to do now is store my dice, and for that purpose, I actually made a little matching dice bag, specifically meant to hold a single set of dice. So, there we go. I'll tie that off later. If I just want to carry one of the dice to show off to people, I also have a mini version. Oh, and for the curious, this is not going to be the last time you see the Nickelodeon-inspired dice molds, because while I do plan on making a couple of color-shifted sets off camera using a green base and an orange base, I also have another project in mind. Now, some of you already know what's special about this particular die, and for those of you that don't, I'm just going to let you speculate down in the comments. And on that cliffhanger, I'm going to go ahead and say, until next time, this is your guy, Cly, signing off.